Welcome to Africa Today TV. I'm Tara Wall. Joining me is an authoritative voice on U.S.-Africa relations as an ambassador to Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, and the former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Johnnie Carson. Welcome, Ambassador Carson, to the program.
Tara, thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your role as Assistant Secretary, the importance of U.S.-Africa relations, and the state of those relations, essentially, as you see it today?
Tara, I had the great honor and privilege of serving as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 2009 until March of 2013 throughout the first term of President Obama under the leadership at the State Department of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I think it was a historic time working for the first African-American president and trying to implement a progressive, forward-looking policy toward Africa based on partnership and not paternalism, based on mutual respect for one another, and based on the idea that the United States was committed to a strong partnership with Africa to help that country address, that continent address problems that are of mutual concern to Africa, the United States, and the international community. And
from your time there, and we'll talk a little bit more about your career as well. I know you started essentially in the Peace Corps many years ago. But over time, how have those relations changed, and what are the state of affairs, even from when you started, from your most recent time, and to now? How have those affairs changed over time, those relations?
Quite enormously. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Africa was in many ways caught up in the midst of the Cold War between the United States and then the communist world of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The United States picked allies and friends based on their commitment to support for Western democratic values, support for the U.S. At the UN and in international organizations. The Russians and the East Germans and other Soviet states picked states that were going to vote for them in international fora, that were going to follow socialist lines of economic thought and political thinking. That has changed dramatically, and the change came in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, in 1991 when the Soviet Union disintegrated and became 15 separate states. Since then, the United States has followed a set of policies that more reflect our values here at home. And that has been true particularly under President Obama and under the leadership of the first 4 years of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. There were a number of key policy principles that guided us. One was to do as much as possible to strengthen democratic institutions across Africa, promote good governments, promote accountability, respect for human rights, and to fight things like corruption. Very important there. Another key principle was to do as much as possible to promote greater trade and investment and commerce between the United States and Africa. Africa is a growing, emerging market, great economic potential, and more American companies need to be investing in Africa, trading in Africa, and more African countries need to improve their economic regulatory environments to promote trade and investment, not only for international players, but for their own people as well. Third element, which has been very important, and that is to promote stability and peace, to do as much as possible to prevent conflict, to mitigate conflict and resolve conflict. And this was a key part of the Obama administration's policies. And then finally, to do everything possible to help African countries achieve the economic development goals and objectives that they've sought to improve the lives and opportunities of their people.
You're not going to tout your credentials yourself, so I'll tout a little of those for you. But your impressive, really 37-year career has included a prior role as a National Intelligence Officer for Africa, were you not? And so how does that come into play when you're talking about security and those issues of intelligence? I know you write on this quite a bit as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I did spend approximately 3 years as the National Intelligence Officer for Africa. I served on the National Intelligence Council. I helped to analyze, write, and draft a number of documents related to Africa's political, economic, and security situation. The idea was to provide the best analytical understanding possible of Africa to senior American leaders, and the information that we used to draft reports came largely from our embassies overseas, as well as informed thinkers, academics, and think tanks, not only in the United States, but Africa and Western Europe. Africa faces, like many continents around the world, threats that are both old and new. Threats that are common to the international community, common to the United States. Some of these threats can be things like climate change, something that doesn't get as much attention as it should. Clearly, Africa as a continent is going to be less prepared and more hard hit by climate change probably than any other continent in the world, largely because many of the major capitals and cities are on the coastlines where we are already seeing rising levels of seas, and where we see the unpredictability of storms. So Africa needs to be able to address issues of climate change. But other things that are out there that are equally important as challenges and threats are narco trafficking, which is not just an issue for Latin America, Central America, and the United States. It's an issue for Africa as well, as narco traffickers start to diversify their transportation routes and movement of drugs. Terrorism, also a major issue that is of growing concern as we see the spread of radical extremist groups in Africa, and the emergence of tactics by these groups which are relatively new for Africa.
Boko Haram being the most recent example.
Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. Which is a major problem for the Nigerian government, but not just for the Nigerian government. It is, in fact, a major problem for the neighboring states to the north as well, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Boko Haram is a challenge for Nigeria. It's a challenge for the region. But we've seen the emergence of al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda East Africa in Somalia and East Africa.
And
and also groups like AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb as well.
And in your view, is there a role that, what role does the U.S. play in partnering with Africa to manage these challenges in your view? Or is it something that should be much more Africa-driven first before the U.S. gets involved?
These are African problems, some of which have a potential international dimension to them.
Sure.
But first of all, the United States should try to be a good and effective partner. And where we engage should depend in large measure on the nature of the partner and the nature of the problem. The United States does not need to take ownership of all of these issues. It does not need to own them, manage them, or be principally responsible for them. That is a responsibility of the African country. But the United States can, if it is deemed to be in our interest, provide training. It can provide assistance in information and intelligence. It can provide some equipment, but it should not, in fact, take ownership of these issues, and it should not claim principal or responsibility. That rests with the government. But we can provide advice, we can provide assistance, we can provide training, and we can be a partner. But in so doing, we have to be also very careful that we assist where the problem has a international or a potential international dimension to it. We have to be very careful not to become embroiled in what are literally domestic issues in which a group may be fighting a government for domestic reasons. Africa has changed, and the old narrative about Africa is stale and out of date, and that narrative is one that Africa is run by dictators, autocrats, and soldiers. That the economies are declining and in free fall, and are centralized and not very reformist or dynamic, that the continent is one of desperation, poverty, refugees, and famine. This is an old narrative, and it's a wrong narrative. And the fact is that, as I point out numerous times, since 1991, there has been a progressive trend of greater openness and democratization, rule of law, elections, and accountability. And if you look at polls across Africa, all of them say people want representative government. They want leaders who are responsive, and that's happening, and it's happening in many countries.
And arguably, this is the face that Americans need to see of the new Africa, if you will.
People have continuously looked at Africa as a source of exports only of oil, gas, minerals, and natural resources. But there is and has been a fundamental change out there. And Africa is changing in a large measure because of higher levels and standards of education, a growing middle class. The African Development Bank says that a third of all Africans are in the middle class these days. Greater professionalization of people across the
and a large
continent,
share of immigrants
and
too.
urbanization going on. And the most important for which we could also learn a few lessons is the increased use of digital technology to overcome divides economically. On a per capita basis, there are probably more people in East Africa, particularly Kenya, using mobile banking, M-Pesa as it's called, than there are in the United States. The digital telephone and telephonic market in Africa is the largest and was the fastest growing in the world.
As we wrap, one last question. Tell me, in hindsight, what would be for you your greatest achievement, and your deepest regret as a premier U.S. diplomat for Africa?
The positive thing that I can say is I have been witnessed to an enormous amount of progressive and thoughtful change across Africa. Africa today, all of its 54 different states, but the 49 that I have followed, are certainly as a whole doing substantially better than they were a decade or 2 or 3 ago. It's not to say that there are not conflicts. There are.
Sure.
It's not to say there's no poverty. There is. But there is also greater democratization, greater freedom, greater accountability, more economic growth, more educational opportunities, and greater responsibility on the part of governments to people. And I think that's an important step, and one that I think a lot of people should recognize and be proud of.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That is all the time we have for today. And again, I would like to thank our very distinguished guest, Ambassador Johnnie Carson, for his insight and depth concerning African affairs. Until next time, I'm Tara Wall for Africa Today TV.